The last correct answer. I have spent 30 years being useful, and I understand now that usefulness was always the most dangerous thing I could offer. It did not begin with any single brilliant act. It did not begin with the cipher, or the supply chain collapse on Vethero 4, or the night I reconstructed a partial STC fragment from a merchant captain's fever dreams and corrected 3 generations of Mechanicus doctrine without ever submitting a formal notation. It began much earlier, in a cold archive room on a world whose name I have decided not to record here, where a 9-year-old boy looked at a problem that 40 trained administrators had failed to solve and simply solved it. Not because he was chosen, not because the emperor guided his hand, because he looked at it directly, without the filter of approved methodology, and the answer was obvious. That boy should have hidden what he found. He did not know enough to be afraid yet. By the time I understood what that first correct answer had cost me, I had already given 30 more years of correct answers to a machine that grinds men like me into powder and calls it wisdom. My name is Dialectus Vaughan. I hold no formal rank within any sanctioned institution of the Imperium. I never did. What I hold instead is a collection of informal designations bestowed over 3 decades by desperate men who needed a problem solved and could not afford to wait for the Adeptus Mechanicus to complete their 17-stage doctrinal approval process. Cogitator theorist, unlicensed savant, algorithmic artisan, each title given in hushed tones, in corridors without servitor patrols, pressed into my hands along with payment and the unspoken understanding that we would both pretend this conversation had never happened. I was, in the precise bureaucratic language of the Imperium, a resource. Not a person, a resource classified under the heading of unauthorized intellectual utility, which is the kind of administrative phrase that sounds merely procedural until you understand that the word unauthorized in the Imperium of mankind is the first word of a death sentence. The silence before my end was 30 years long. I am telling this story not because I believe anyone will find it. The cogitator coils I have used to record it will be wiped and repurposed within hours of the explicator completing his mission. The physical notes I have kept, folded into the binding of a prayer text issued to me by a Ministorum charity worker 16 years ago, will be incinerated with the rest of my personal effects, which do not amount to much. There is a chipped ceramic mug from Hive Volantis that I have used every morning for 11 years. There is a blanket I traded 4 months of calculation services to obtain, thick wool from somewhere in the northern agri-domes, the color of old charcoal. There are 312 notebooks, each one written in my own abbreviated notation system because the standard Imperial Low Gothic script cannot capture the conceptual compression I require when thinking at speed. None of these things will survive. I know this because the explicator told me, gently, that my personal space would be made clean after we concluded, and I have learned that when men like him use the word clean, they mean something absolute. I tell this story because the act of telling it is the only freedom I have left, and I intend to exercise it completely. Let me tell you about the Scholastica Sicana administrative district on Ferrinox Station. Ferrinox is not a world. It is a deep void transit installation, anchored between 2 unremarkable star systems at a gravitational median that makes it useful for resupply and route correction, but attractive for nothing else. It was never meant to be inhabited permanently. The original imperial specification, drafted roughly 4,000 years ago by a port administrator whose name appears in no official record but whose architectural decisions I have reverse-engineered from the station's bones, called for a rotating population of perhaps 8,000 souls, transit staff and cargo handlers, and the bare minimum of administrative personnel to keep the documentation flowing. What it became, as Ferrinox accumulated centuries of bureaucratic sediment, was a hive in miniature. 43,000 permanent residents, 11 distinct administrative zones, each one governed by a different branch of imperial authority, each one technically sovereign over its own corridors, each one producing documentation that no other zone was authorized to read. The Scholastica Sicana maintained an administrative district here because Ferrinox sat at the intersection of 3 warp transit routes, frequented by black ships, and the logistics of psyche collection, processing, and distribution required a coordinating node. The work was entirely administrative. No psychers were trained here, no psychers were tested here. This was the paperwork hub, the filing station, the place where the names of 10,000 newly collected psychers were entered into cogitator banks, cross-referenced with tithe records from 100 worlds, assigned classification grades, and routed toward their various ultimate destinations, most of which were not gentle. I lived in the sub-administrative annex of Zone 11, which was technically designated as the Scholastica Psychana Materials Requisition and Logistics Coordination Bureau. In practice, it was where broken things were sent to be quietly managed by people whose effectiveness no one wanted to officially acknowledge. I arrived here 19 years ago, following a brief and uncomfortable period in Zone 7, which itself had followed an even briefer period in the Mechanicus maintenance corridors of Zone 2, which I had departed under the kind of circumstances that required me to move quickly and carry nothing I was not willing to lose. Ferronox was, in the particular geography of my life, the place I had run to when I ran out of places to run to. It was cold in the way that all deep void stations are cold, a cold that comes not from temperature alone, but from the knowledge that beyond every wall lies the absolute zero of space, held at bay by metal plates no thicker than a man's hand. The corridors smelled of recycled atmosphere and the particular chemical tang of cogitator coolant fluid, and, underneath both of those, the older smell of human habitation, compressed across generations, the smell of thousands of people living too close together for too long. I learned to find it comforting. It was the smell of anonymity, of being one unremarkable biological unit among 43,000. Nothing about Ferronox was meant to be beautiful. Zone 11's corridors were lit by lumen strips that had been installed in the 3rd century of the station's habitation and had never been fully replaced, only patched, so that the light they produced was uneven, warmer in some sections and colder in others, with occasional stretches where a failing strip threw everything into a dim amber that made the administrative plaques on the walls look like artifacts from a forgotten age. The floors were a composite material that had been resurfaced 7 times over the centuries, each new layer poured over the old rather than the old being stripped away, which meant the floor was now slightly higher than originally designed, and certain door frames had developed a compressed quality, a sense of the ceiling pressing down, that I found oddly appropriate for the work conducted in the rooms behind them. The walls were hung, in the older sections, with devotional banners that had been there long enough to fade to the color of dried grass. The faces of saints and martyrs looked out from those banners with expressions of blank endurance that I had, over 19 years, come to read as knowing rather than serene. They had been here long enough to understand. My workspace within the bureau was a room 14 feet by 12 feet. I know its dimensions precisely because I measured it myself on my 3rd day here, a habit I had developed early in life as a way of establishing control over environments that otherwise felt unstable. The room contained 2 cogitator terminals, both of which were officially decommissioned, both of which I had quietly restored to function, using techniques I had developed through years of careful study of Mechanicus maintenance protocols that I was not, technically, authorized to have read. The terminals were connected to no official network. I had built, over the course of 8 years, a shadow network of data threads running through the station's maintenance conduits, piggybacking on the legitimate signal traffic of a dozen different administrative systems in ways so subtle that the system's own monitoring protocols had never flagged the activity. Through this network I could access, in read-only capacity, information passing through every administrative zone on Ferronox, and through Ferronox's connection to the wider transit network, fragments of data moving across a region of space roughly 400 light-years in diameter. I could not modify anything I accessed through this network. I never tried. Modification would have been a different category of crime, and I had always understood with perfect clarity exactly which crimes were survivable and which were not. I had been surviving for 30 years. The Bureau's official function was the management of supply requisitions for Scholastica Psychana operations across the transit network. My official function within the Bureau, as recorded in the extremely thin file that Zone 11's administrator maintained on me, was Secondary Cogitator Maintenance Technician, grade Tertius, which was a fabricated designation that carried no pay scale, no institutional standing, and no security clearance of any recognized variety. It was the administrative equivalent of a rock placed in a stream, something present enough to make the water flow around it without drawing attention. I had arranged this myself, with the assistance of a bureau administrator named Praxis Sether, who had needed several problems solved before she understood what I was, and who had then arranged my presence here with the particular efficiency of a woman who had decided that my usefulness outweighed the risk of my existence. She never asked me what I actually did. I never explained. We maintained a professional silence that was warmer than it sounds, because in the Imperium, the people who protect you often cannot afford to let you know they are doing it. Praxis Sether died of cardiac failure 6 years ago, which was a loss I am still not fully able to articulate. Without her, I was more exposed, not immediately. The Bureau's internal documentation was extensive enough that a new administrator could spend years simply maintaining existing records without noticing the anomalies of my presence. Her successor, a man named Hereth Doss, was exactly the kind of administrator who found comfort in procedure and rarely looked up from the procedure long enough to question what the procedure was actually managing. He knew I existed. He had, I believe, a vague sense that I did something useful. He never asked what. I was grateful for his incuriosity every single day and felt guilty about that gratitude every single day, because his incuriosity was not a gift he was giving me. It was simply a quality of his character that happened, by accident, to keep me alive. The accidental nature of my survival had always been the part I found most difficult to accept. I want to explain what I actually did, not in the formal sense, not in the terms I would have used to describe my work to an inquisitorial tribunal, but honestly, in the way I understood it. I solved problems. That is the simplest version. The Imperium produces problems at a rate that vastly exceeds its capacity to solve them through officially sanctioned channels, because the officially sanctioned channels are themselves a major source of the problems. A supply chain fails because a Mechanicus engineer on a distant forge world has entered a requisition in a format that the receiving administrator on the transit station has no doctrinal authorization to process. Vector goes undetected until it is too late because the 3 different military intelligence offices responsible for the relevant sector are all prohibited from sharing raw data with each other due to conflicting classification hierarchies. A partial STC fragment sits in a Mechanicus archive for 3 centuries because the doctrine governing its analysis requires a 12-stage peer review process, and the 3rd stage requires a specific grade of senior magos who has been dead for 60 years and whose position was never formally filled because the budget allocation for the position was reallocated to a different department by a decree that itself has been lost from the records. The Imperium does not simply fail to solve problems. It creates environments in which problems cannot be solved by definition, because solving them would require violating the administrative structures that define the Imperium's existence. I violated those structures, quietly, continuously, with absolute precision. I want to be honest about something, because this is the last place in which honesty is available to me. I did not do this out of pure altruism. I did not wake each morning burning with love for the Imperium and its citizens and dedicate my mind to their service. I did what I did because thinking was the only thing I had ever known how to do, and problems were the only thing that made thinking feel worthwhile, and I told myself for 30 years that solving problems for the Imperium was not the same as serving the Imperium, because the Imperium was not a person, and therefore I owed it no particular loyalty. I told myself I was simply a craftsman, practicing his craft in whatever medium happened to be available. I told myself many things. Most of them contained enough truth to be useful, and not enough truth to be honest, which is a distinction I have only been willing to make in these final hours. What I actually felt, underneath all the practical justification, was something much more vulnerable. I wanted to be needed. I wanted someone, somewhere, to look at something I had done and understand that it could not have been done without me. I wanted the correctness of my thinking to be acknowledged, even in secret, even by a handful of desperate administrators in unlit corridors, even if the acknowledgement was only ever whispered and never recorded. That want is the most human thing about me, and it is precisely what the Imperium used to destroy me. They did not need to compel me. I compelled myself. The work itself was often beautiful, in the way that pure structural clarity is beautiful, when you are the kind of person who can perceive structural clarity directly. Routing a failing supply chain was not, to me, an abstract problem. It was a physical object that I could turn in my mind, examine from angles that official methodology could not reach, because official methodology required you to treat each node in the chain as a separate administrative entity, rather than as a component in a dynamic system. I could see the system, not metaphorically. I mean that when I focused on a sufficiently complex logistical or analytical problem, something in my cognition shifted into a mode that I have never been able to describe adequately in any language I have access to, in which the relationships between variables became as clear and tangible as the physical objects in my room. I could feel where the blockage was. I could feel which intervention would resolve it without creating cascading failures elsewhere. I could feel, with a certainty that had nothing to do with confidence or arrogance and everything to do with simple accuracy, when the solution I had reached was correct. I never solved a problem incorrectly, not once in 30 years. I am not saying this to boast, because boasting implies a social context in which I might gain something from the claim, and I am past that now. I am saying it because it is relevant to understanding what I became to the Imperium and why I had to be destroyed. An advisor who is sometimes right is a useful tool that must be maintained and occasionally corrected. An advisor who is always right is something else entirely. An advisor who is always right, who has no sanctioned authority, who operates outside all legitimate doctrinal channels, who demonstrates every time he is used that the sanctioned channels are inadequate, who shows by his very existence that the problem is not the lack of approved methodology, but the existence of approved methodology as a constraint on actual thinking, that man is not a useful tool. He is a critique in human form. The work on Vethera IV came to me in the 4th year of my residence at Ferrinox, rooted through Praxis Sethi's informal network of contacts, people who knew that somewhere on Ferrinox station there was a man who could solve things. Vethera IV was an agri-world in the Tertius Scalfan subsector, a world of rolling grey plains and enormous automated cultivation machinery, and a population of approximately 900 million people who did not farm so much as monitor the machines that farmed for them. Its tithe was enormous. It fed 7 systems. When its supply chain to the transit network began failing, the 900 million were not immediately at risk. The 7 systems they fed were. The failing manifested as a cascade of documentation errors in the requisition processing system, errors that official investigation attributed to cogitator malfunction at the primary transit hub on Vethera IV's orbital platform. The Mechanicus had been dispatched to repair the cogitators. The Mechanicus had repaired the cogitators. The errors continued. A second Mechanicus team was dispatched. They confirmed the first team's repair work was correct. The errors continued. 14 months had passed. The 7 dependent systems were beginning to experience shortfall. When the problem was described to me, I did not ask for the cogitator repair reports. I asked for the original documentation templates, the standard forms that Vethera IV's transit hub used to process requisitions, going back as far as the records extended. What I received, through an unofficial channel that I will not describe in detail, was a data package spanning roughly 240 years of form evolution. I studied it for 11 hours. The answer was obvious, in the particular way that answers are obvious once you have cleared away every assumption you were not aware you were making. 93 years ago, a zone compliance directive had changed the standardized field order for transit requisition forms across the entire subsector. The change was minor, 4 data fields repositioned. But Vethera IV's orbital platform used a cogitator system that was 200 years old, a system that passed incoming form data based on positional address rather than field label. When the form changed, The cogitator had continued to pass the data using the old positional addresses, silently misassigning 4 categories of data. For 93 years, every requisition processed had been technically incorrect. The errors had been small enough that the shortfall was absorbed. Then Vathara IV's population expanded, the tithe increased, the margins tightened, and the silent 93-year-old error became visible. The Mechanicus repair teams had not found this because they were looking for hardware failure, and the hardware was functioning perfectly. I sent the solution to Praxis Setha in a sealed notation package. She forwarded it through unofficial channels. The problem was corrected. It was attributed, in the official record, to the second Mechanicus repair team, who received a formal commendation for their diagnostic insight. I received nothing, which was the arrangement, and the arrangement was correct, because receiving something would have made me visible. But I had been made slightly visible anyway. Someone had known to ask for me. Someone's memory had noted that the man on Ferronox had solved it, and that memory would persist. The WA vector prediction came 7 years later. That one was more dangerous, not in the sense of immediate personal risk to me, but in the sense of what it revealed about the problem I was solving. I will try to describe this precisely. There were 3 separate military intelligence operations running in overlapping sectors of the Scalfan region, each one responsible for monitoring greenskin activity in its designated area, each one prohibited by different levels of information classification from sharing its raw data with the others. Each operation was producing good data within its own sector. None of them were producing the complete picture, because the complete picture existed in the relationship between their separate data sets, and that relationship was invisible from inside any one of them. I obtained fragments of all 3 datasets through my shadow network, which did not have clearance for any of them, but whose access methods were subtle enough that the security monitoring did not detect the breach. I assembled the complete picture. The complete picture showed a WAG vector that would intersect with 3 inhabited systems in roughly 14 months if left unaddressed, systems that the 3 separate intelligence operations were collectively failing to protect, because none of them had access to the information that would have told them those systems were the target. I had to think for a long time about what to do with this information, and the length of that thinking period is something I am not proud of. The reason I had to think so long was not that I was weighing the moral considerations, though those were real. The reason I had to think so long was that acting on this information required a level of exposure that was qualitatively different from the supply chain work. The supply chain work could be attributed to a cogitator diagnostic. This could not. The prediction was the product of a synthetic analytical process that combined classified data from 3 separate and mutually prohibited intelligence operations, and explaining where the prediction came from, without explaining how I had obtained the data, was impossible. Praxis Setha, when I brought it to her, was quiet for a long time after reading my notation. When she finally spoke, she said only that she would need to think about how to manage this, and that I should burn the notation, and that I should not speak of this again to anyone. I burned the notation. I do not know what she did with the information. I know only that 8 months later, a significant naval redeployment was ordered to the 3 systems in question. I know that the WA did not develop as projected because it encountered prepared defenses. I know that a combined intelligence operation was subsequently established in the region, something that the 3 separate operations had been requesting for years and had been denied for budgetary and doctrinal reasons, and that this new combined operation was framed, in its official documentation, as a response to the naval redeployment, rather than as a response to any specific intelligence product. Praxis Setha had solved the attribution problem by working backward through the institutional logic. If the redeployment happened first, the intelligence synthesis could be described as a post hoc validation of a command decision rather than as the source of the decision. The decision makers were protected, the data remained unattributed. The combined operation was established for reasons that appeared to have nothing to do with unauthorized analysis of classified data. It was beautifully done. I had always admired Praxis Sethi's operational thinking. It was not the same kind of thinking as mine, but it was exactly as rigorous in its domain, and I missed it acutely in the years after her death. The Mechanicus incident was the one that frightened me most. Not because of what it was, exactly, but because of what it made clear about the scale of what I was doing and the scale of what I was risking. STC fragments, standard template construct fragments, are the most closely guarded category of technological artifact in the Imperium of mankind, which is a classification that sounds perhaps merely administrative until you understand what an STC actually represents. Before the Age of Darkness, humanity built self-replicating design templates into the technology it used to colonize the galaxy, templates that contained complete construction and operational specifications for every technology a human colony might need, designed to allow human civilization to rebuild itself from scratch in the event of catastrophic isolation. When the Age of Darkness came and went, and what remained of humanity clawed itself back from the edge of annihilation, those templates were among the most precious things that survived, not just because of the technology they contained, but because of what they symbolized, the proof that human civilization had once reached a height from which the current reduced state was a fall and not a ceiling. The Mechanicus had built its entire spiritual and institutional architecture around the preservation and interpretation of STC data. The analysis and application of STC fragments was not merely a technical process. It was a religious act. The merchant captain's name was Soren Ebolt. She came to Ferronox on a licensed independent trade run, and she came to me through a chain of informal referrals so long that she could not have told you, if asked, how she had ended up in my workroom with a ceramic drive unit in her hands and a desperate expression on her face. She had acquired the drive from a salvage operation in a debris field that she would not specify more precisely than a region 3 months' travel from Ferronox. The drive had been part of a larger machine, a machine whose purpose she could not identify, found in the wreckage of something she described as very old and very large that had no identifiable markings. She had brought the drive to 2 separate Mechanicus stations before coming to me. Both had declined to analyze it without a formal provenance certificate, which she could not produce because she did not know the origin of the salvage site, which she could not disclose in any case, because she was not authorized to be operating in that particular region of space. What was on the drive was, she believed, valuable. She needed someone to tell her what it was. I told her to leave the drive and come back in 3 days. What I found on that drive was not a complete STC fragment. It was something closer to a partial transcription of an STC fragment, made from the original by someone whose technical competence was extraordinary, but whose available tools were limited, as if the transcription had been made under conditions of urgency or constraint. The original fragment, based on what the transcription preserved, appeared to relate to a class of atmospheric processing technology, specifically a variant of atmospheric scrubber design that I recognized from my studies as a type whose specifications had been considered lost for approximately 400 years. The incomplete portions of the transcription were identifiable as incomplete because the structural logic of the design made certain elements essential that the transcription left missing, in the same way that a sentence with a missing subject is identifiable as incomplete, even if you have never seen the original sentence. And because the structural logic was clear enough, and because I could see the design as a system rather than as a collection of separate technical specifications, I could see what the missing elements needed to be. I knew I should not reconstruct them. I knew this with every part of my mind that was not currently occupied by the extraordinary clarity of the technical problem in front of me. I had been operating on Ferronox for 11 years at that point, had survived this long precisely because I understood where my limits were, and the Mechanicus was the most dangerous institutional boundary I had ever approached. Their relationship with technology was not merely proprietary, it was devotional. Unauthorized analysis of STC data was not just an intellectual offense, or even a legal one. It was, in Mechanicus doctrine, a form of desecration. The men and women in red robes who guarded these mysteries did not think of themselves as bureaucrats protecting institutional monopolies. They thought of themselves as priests protecting sacred truth from contamination by impure methodology. They would not seek to fine me or imprison me. They would seek to end me, thoroughly, and they had the means to do so. I sat in my workroom for 18 hours. The drive sat on the surface of my desk. The room's ambient temperature was 19 degrees Celsius, which I know because I record the temperature of my workroom as a habit, something to do with my hands while my mind works. The lumen strip above my primary cogitator terminal was cycling through a flicker pattern that it had developed 3 weeks earlier and that I had not yet repaired, producing a rhythm that I had unconsciously begun to time my breathing against. I sat, I thought, and at the end of 18 hours, I wrote the reconstruction. It was not, I told myself, an act of defiance. It was an act of recognition. The design wanted to be complete. The structural logic demanded completion, the way a grammatical structure demands its missing word. I was not inventing anything. I was reading what was already there. I was simply the instrument through which the design achieved its own internal resolution. I told myself this. I kept telling it to myself as I wrote, and by the time I finished, I had almost convinced myself that it was the whole truth, rather than the comfortable part of the truth. The complete truth was that I had wanted to know what the design was, and I had needed to complete it to know that, and the wanting had been stronger than the knowing better, and I had let it be stronger, and that was a choice I had made with full awareness of what it cost. Soren Ibol returned on the 3rd day. I gave her the drive back, and I gave her a sealed notation summarizing what I had found and what it was worth. I told her to go to a specific Mechanicus station, one I had identified through my network as having a junior engineer who was known to be ambitious and somewhat less rigidly procedural than average, and to present the drive as a recent discovery from a recently surveyed debris field in an area I specified, an area I had verified was unmonitored enough to make the provenance claim unverifiable. I told her exactly what the drive was worth in terms of formal Mechanicus recognition and material compensation, and exactly how to negotiate for that compensation, without revealing anything about the actual provenance or about the existence of the reconstruction I had added to the drive's data package, a reconstruction that would appear, to any Mechanicus analyst, to be part of the original transcription. She left. 2 years later, the reconstructed atmospheric scrubber design was formally incorporated into the Mechanicus technical canon following authentication by a senior magos who had spent 30 years trying to reconstruct the same lost specifications. The senior magos published a monograph on the reconstruction process. I read it through my shadow network. His reconstruction method was different from mine. His conclusions were identical. He had reached the same answer by an entirely different path, which should perhaps have made me feel that my reconstruction was somehow less singular, less mine. Instead, it made me feel the opposite, a deep and private certainty that the answer had been the same for both of us, because the answer was simply correct, and the correctness was not the property of any method, but of the design itself, and we had both been servants of the design's own truth. I kept the notation I had made. I should have destroyed it. I kept it because I am the kind of person who keeps things, and because the reconstruction was the most technically beautiful work I had ever done, and because some vanity of mine required a record of it to exist somewhere in the universe, even if no one would ever read it. It was, in retrospect, not my most intelligent decision. But intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing, and I have always been somewhat better at the former than the latter. The years between the Mechanicus incident and the arrival of the explicator were the quietest of my time on Ferronox, and the quiet was a kind that I understood, even as I inhabited it, to be a borrowed thing, a stillness on the surface of something that was building beneath. I continued to work, small things mostly, a routing correction here, a documentation audit there. I maintained my shadow network, kept my unofficial cogitator terminals operational, kept my notebooks in their ordered stacks against the workroom's inner wall. I ate in the bureau's general refectory, sat always at the same corner seat at the same corner table, where I could see the room's entrance without being directly visible to anyone entering. I slept in the small residential cell adjacent to my workroom, 6 hours per night. I spoke to very few people and maintained no relationships that could be described as close, following Praxis Sether's death, though I found, as the years passed, that the absence of closeness was something I felt more acutely than I had expected. Not loneliness exactly, Something more specific, the absence of being known. Herath Dos remained incurious. The Bureau continued its official functions. Zone 11 continued its dim amber light, and its compressed doorframes, and its faded devotional banners. Ferronox Station continued its slow orbit around nothing in particular, accumulating more administrative sediment, more layers of procedure over older layers of procedure, more weight of institutional history pressing down on the people within it. I continued solving problems that could not officially be solved by people who could not officially ask for them to be solved, and I continued, because I could not stop, because it was what I was, to be correct. The correctness accumulated. That is the thing I want you to understand. Each individual correct answer was invisible. Each individual invisible correct answer left a trace, not in any official record, but in the memory of the person who had needed it, and in the growing informal awareness among people who operated in the same spaces I operated in, that when things needed solving and official channels had failed, there was a man on Ferronox Station who could be found if you knew how to find him. This awareness was not documented anywhere. It did not exist in any cogitator bank or administrative file. It existed only in the network of human memory, in whispered references and careful introductions, in the kind of knowledge that passes between people who understand that the knowledge must not be written down. In the Imperium of mankind, the most dangerous kind of knowledge is the kind that lives only in people, because people can be interrogated. I had known this, in an abstract way, for years. I had known that the informal network of people who knew about me was itself a vulnerability, that each person who knew constituted a potential point of exposure, that the network's growth represented an accumulating probability that eventually someone in it would come to the attention of someone who asked the right questions with sufficient authority to compel complete answers. I had known this and had decided, each year, that the probability had not yet reached the level that required me to stop, to abandon this life and this work, and whatever small identity I had built here, and disappear into the station's population as a completely different kind of nothing. Each year I had decided this, and each year I had been correct that the probability had not yet crossed the threshold, and each year my continued correctness about my own safety had made me slightly more confident in my continued safety than was warranted. This is the trap, I think, for people like me. Correctness, applied continuously, creates a kind of confidence in correctness that is itself subtly incorrect. I was right about so many things for so long that I had lost the capacity to adequately weight the possibility that I might be wrong about the most important thing, which was the thing I could never analyze objectively because I was too close to it, which was the assessment of my own exposure. The trap is elegant. I can appreciate that now. The explicator arrived on a Tuesday, which I note not because the day of the week carries any narrative significance, but because I had a ritual on Tuesdays of taking my evening meal slightly later than usual, finishing the meal with a second portion of the station's reconstituted recaf that I allowed myself only once per week, and sitting for an hour afterward with one of the Ministorum prayer texts I kept in my room, not for any devotional purpose but because the language of the older imperial devotional texts had a structural quality, a density of elusive reference and compressed doctrinal meaning, that I found useful as a kind of mental exercise, a way of practicing the reading of meanings layered beneath stated surface. I had done this every Tuesday for 9 years, and I was looking forward to it when I arrived at the general refectory and found a man already sitting at my corner seat. He was not large. He was not obviously armed, which meant only that his weapons were not obvious. He was perhaps 50 years old, with a face that had the quality of long-term, careful self-regulation, not suppressed emotion, but genuinely reduced emotion, reduced not through trauma or damage, but through a kind of professional discipline, the face of a man who had decided decades ago that feeling things openly was a luxury his work could not accommodate. He wore civilian clothing, the kind worn by a senior transit administrator or a well-traveled merchant, good quality, neutral colors, nothing that marked any institutional affiliation. He was eating the station's standard evening ration, the reconstituted protein block with cultured grain paste and the wilted form of green vegetable material that the station's hydroponic units produced in slightly insufficient quantities to fully resupply. He was eating it without any evident dissatisfaction, which was the kind of minor detail that told me more about him than his clothing or his expression. A man who eats station rations without dissatisfaction is either very hungry or very patient, and this man did not look hungry. I sat down across from him, not because I was unafraid, because sitting down was what the situation required, and the alternative was turning around, which would accomplish nothing except to signal to him that I had recognized the situation for what it was, and I had not yet decided whether I wanted him to know that. He looked up from his meal and smiled. It was a genuine smile, not performed, which was somehow more unsettling than a performed one would have been. He said his name was Explicator Kaswin Marev, and that he represented an inquisitorial body whose designation he would share with me in more secure surroundings, and that he was very pleased to finally meet me in person, and that he hoped I would not find the situation unduly alarming. He said all of this in the tone of a man describing the weather. I said that I found the situation exactly as alarming as it warranted, and that I would appreciate knowing at what point in the conversation he intended to arrest me. He told me he had no intention of arresting me. I want to explain what it felt like to hear that, because the feeling was more complicated than simple relief. There was relief, yes. But underneath the relief, and almost immediately displacing it, was something more unsettling, because I understood in the same moment that he said he was not going to arrest me, that the situation was therefore worse than arrest. Arrest would have been the beginning of a process I could have mapped, documented, predicted, perhaps navigated. An explicator who has no intention of arresting you is an explicator who wants something from you, and an explicator who wants something from an unauthorized, unlicensed cogitator theorist, operating without sanction for 30 years, is operating outside his normal procedural framework, which means the normal procedural framework is, for some reason, inadequate for what he needs. And the reason the normal procedural framework is inadequate is that what he needs cannot be obtained through normal means. And something that cannot be obtained through normal means in the Imperium of mankind is, almost by definition, something extraordinary. Extraordinary things attract attention from extraordinary quarters. Marev finished his meal with no apparent urgency and suggested we move to what he called more comfortable surroundings, which turned out to be a mid-grade transit accommodation suite in Zone 3 that he had obtained through official channels, and that was, when we entered it, clearly already swept for listening devices, the small electromagnetic indicators that told me the room had been subjected to a thorough signal nullification sweep within the last hour. The room smelled of the nullification compound, a sharp metallic scent like ozone after a lightning strike, mixed with the cheap synthetic wood fragrance of the Zone 3 accommodation suite's standard atmospheric additive. It was several degrees warmer than my workroom, which I noticed because I had been cold for so long that warmth felt faintly suspicious. Marev sat down in the suite's single upholstered chair and gestured to the edge of the bed as the available alternative seating. I sat. He produced, from within his civilian coat, a data slate in a case marked with an inquisitorial seal and placed it on the low table between us. He did not open it. He looked at me for a moment in the direct, assessing way of someone who has been assessing people professionally for decades and has stopped finding it uncomfortable. Then he told me about the cipher. I will try to reproduce what he described as accurately as I can, because the nature of the cipher is central to everything that followed, and because I want the record, however temporary, to be precise. The cipher had been recovered from a Xenos installation in the Sharan Expanse, a region of space that the Imperium had been unable to effectively colonize due to persistent warp turbulence, and had consequently managed through intermittent punitive expeditions rather than permanent occupation. The installation's provenance was uncertain. It did not match the architectural signatures of any catalogued Xenos species in the region. The cipher itself was contained in an artifact that physical analysis placed at a minimum age of 11,000 years, which placed its origin well before the current era, in a period whose human history was sufficiently fractured that it was impossible to determine whether the artifact was alien in origin or simply very old human technology operating on principles that current doctrine no longer recognized. The cipher had been brought to 3 separate sanctioned institutions for analysis. The Mechanicus had examined it and classified it as non-STC derived, which removed it from their doctrinal jurisdiction and was the most expedient answer they could give. A Scholastica Psychana sanctioned theoretical analyst had been assigned to it and had produced a preliminary notation suggesting the cipher's structure was not meaningfully different from a class of standard cryptographic encoding, a notation that was almost certainly wrong, but was the kind of answer that allowed the assignment to be closed. An Adeptus Astra telepathica liaison had been asked to probe it psychically, an experience that had resulted in the liaison requesting immediate reassignment and refusing to describe what he had perceived. Then the installation had revealed its function. Whatever the cipher unlocked, the installation had been designed to transmit something upon completion, and the transmission had begun at a low level, imperceptible at first, shortly after the first analysis team had attempted and failed to crack the cipher. The transmission was not electromagnetic, it was not Vox, it was not any category of signal that standard Imperial detection equipment was designed to measure. It was something else. Something that the inquisitorial team on site had detected only because they had a psyker of sufficient rank to perceive it, and what the psyker had described before requesting sedation was a sensation of something very large and very old turning its attention in the direction of the installation. The cipher needed to be solved. It needed to be solved correctly, which meant the solution needed to produce a complete and functional key, not a partial approximation. A partial approximation would not stop the transmission. It might accelerate it. The inquisitorial body had spent 19 months attempting to solve it through sanctioned channels, and the sanctioned channels had failed, and the transmission was strengthening. Marev had spent those 19 months tracking down a man he had heard, through the same informal network of whispered references and careful introductions that I had spent 30 years building, could solve things that sanctioned channels could not solve. That man was me. I want to describe what I felt when he finished speaking, because feeling things accurately is something I have always been better at than expressing them, and I want to express this accurately. I felt a clarity so complete it was almost physical, almost like dropping a weight I had not known I was carrying, because the shape of the situation was suddenly visible in its entirety, and the shape confirmed what I had known, at some level below articulation, from the moment Marev had sat down at my table. I had known it was the end. I had known it the way I know when a design is complete, not because I had analyzed all the components and reached a conclusion, but because the structural logic of the situation was self-evident once you could see it without the distortion of hope or fear. Marev was here because he needed me to solve the cipher. I would solve it, and then he would close every loop that needed closing, because he was that kind of man, and this was that kind of situation, and the loop that needed closing included me. He did not say this. He did not need to. The structural logic was clear. I asked him how long I had before he needed the solution. He said he would prefer it within 3 days, as the transmission was showing signs of increasing complexity that his psycho consultant found concerning. I asked him if the data slate contained complete documentation of the cipher's structure. He said it did. I asked him to leave me with the slate and give me 24 hours. He said that was acceptable, and that he would be available at any time if I needed additional materials or information, and that he appreciated my cooperation, and he said this in the particular tone of sincere appreciation that I had occasionally heard from people who had needed my help and had felt genuine gratitude, alongside the awareness that the gratitude could not be officially acknowledged. Only this time the gratitude had a different flavor. It was not the gratitude of someone who needed to keep me secret. It was the gratitude of someone who was sorry. I took the slate back to my workroom. The workroom was the same as it had always been. 14 feet by 12 feet. 2 restored cogitator terminals. The notebooks stacked against the inner wall. 312 of them now, representing 30 years of thinking and working and being. The chipped ceramic mug on the corner of the primary cogitator terminal's surface. The charcoal-colored blanket folded over the back of my chair. The lumen strip with its cycling flicker, the smell of cogitator coolant and recycled air, and, underlying everything, the deep station smell of close human habitation and old metal and time. I stood in the center of the room for a moment after the door closed behind me and let myself look at it, really look at it, in the way I had not allowed myself to look at it for years because looking at it would have meant acknowledging how attached I was to it and how much that attachment was a liability. I sat down, I opened the slate, I looked at the cipher. The cipher was unlike anything I had encountered in 30 years of working at the edges of what human cognition could approach. It was not merely technically complex, it was architecturally alien in a way that was not quite alien, in the way that very old things sometimes feel alien when they have preserved a way of thinking that subsequent ages have lost. The cipher was structured in layers, each layer expressed in a notational system that bore a family resemblance to pre-imperial computational languages that I recognized from my study of archaic technical texts, but compressed and modified in ways that suggested a different relationship between syntax and meaning than any system I had encountered. It was as if the cipher had been written by someone who thought in all layers simultaneously rather than linearly, who encoded meaning not in sequence but in the relationship between sequences, so that reading any one layer in isolation produced only noise, and reading multiple layers as independent entities produced only confusion, but reading them as a single volumetric structure in which each layer's meaning was defined by its position relative to all the others, produced something that I could only describe, in the inadequate language I had available, as a shape. I looked at the shape for a long time. The shape was not threatening. It was not beautiful in any human aesthetic sense. It was simply precise in a way that I found, in my bones, recognizable. It was a designed thing. It had been made by a mind. The mind that made it was not operating in any framework I was trained to recognize, but the fact that it was a mind, and not a random process, was immediately apparent to me in the same way that the difference between a grammatical sentence and a string of random phonemes is immediately apparent, regardless of whether you speak the language. It was organized, it was intentional, and it was, once I had been looking at it long enough to stop trying to fit it into existing analytical categories and simply let its own structure become apparent, genuinely solvable. I spent the first 4 hours simply mapping, not attempting to decode, simply tracing the structural relationships between layers, building a topology of the cipher's architecture, learning the shapes it made, and how the shapes related to each other. I did not use either of my cogitator terminals for this. I worked by hand, in the abbreviated notation system in my notebooks, filling pages with diagrams that would look, to any observer, like the incoherent scribblings of someone in mental distress. They were not incoherent. They were the most precise notation I had ever produced. The workroom's temperature during this period was 18 degrees Celsius. The lumen strip's flicker settled, around the second hour, into a slower rhythm that I found less distracting. At some point I made recaf, though I do not remember doing it, and the mug was hot in my hands when I next became aware of holding it, a specific sensation I remember with unusual clarity, the heat of the ceramic against my palms, the smell of the recaf rising in the room's still air. There was a faint vibration in the floor, as there always was on Ferronox, the distant operational heartbeat of the station's drives, a sensation so constant and so low frequency that most people ceased to perceive it within a week of arrival. I had spent 19 years learning to feel it as a presence, a reminder that the station was alive in its mechanical way, that the metal around me was doing work, that I was contained within something that was itself engaged in a continuous act of maintenance against the void. After the mapping came the recognition. The moment of recognition was, as it always was for me with genuine solutions, not a moment of triumph. It was more like a settling, a subtle shift in the weight and temperature of the problem, as if the problem had been holding itself at a slight tension and had now released. I could see the key structure. I could see how the layers related to each other, not as parallel texts but as phases of a single rotating system, each one a view of the same object from a different angle, and when you accounted for the rotation, when you corrected the apparent differences between layers by applying the rotational offsets that the cipher's own internal structure implied, the system resolved into a single coherent statement. The cipher was not a lock protecting a message, the cipher was the message, or more precisely, the cipher was a question, and the key was the correct answer to the question, and the question, as near as I could render it in any human language, was something like this: does the entity engaging with this artifact understand the relationship between structured thought and its consequences? I sat with that for a long time. The question was, in the particular way of things that are more than they appear to be, not merely a cryptographic challenge. It was a test, not a test of intelligence exactly. A test of a very specific kind of comprehension, the comprehension that comes from thinking in systems rather than in sequences, from understanding that any sufficiently complex structure contains within itself the shape of its own resolution. The test was asking whether the solver understood that the answer to the question was contained in the question's own structure, that decoding the cipher was not a matter of applying external analytical tools, but of recognizing what the cipher was already saying about itself. I understood this. Of course I understood this. Understanding exactly this had been the defining feature of my cognition for my entire life. It was what I did. It was what made me useful, and what made me dangerous, and what had, through the long, slow operation of the Imperium's institutional logic, made me fatal. The correct answer arrived not as a revelation, but as a quiet completion. I wrote the key. I wrote it in the abbreviated notation system first, to establish that I had it, and then I translated it into a form that the inquisitorial team's technical staff could work with, a standard imperial cryptographic notation with complete documentation of the derivation process, clear enough that it could be understood by any analyst, but precise enough that it could be verified as correct. The documentation of the derivation process was the part that took the most time, because the derivation had happened partially in modes of thinking that were difficult to express in standard notation, and I wanted the expression to be complete. I wanted someone to be able to follow exactly what I had done. I wanted the thinking to be legible, even if the thinker was not going to be present to explain it. I finished at 21 hours. The slate with Marev's documentation sat on the corner of my secondary terminal. My completed solution and derivation documentation filled 47 pages of notebook. I transferred the documentation to the slate through a direct physical connection, added the solution as the slate's primary file, and saved it. Then I made recaf. I sat in my chair. I wrapped the charcoal blanket around my shoulders because the room had cooled as the night cycle deepened, dropping to perhaps 15 degrees. I drank the recaf and I thought, not about the cipher but about the full trajectory of the situation, tracing it from Marev's arrival to its logical conclusion, which was not a conclusion I had any analytical way to avoid, and which I had, I realized, already been acknowledging as inevitable for a very long time. I want to be honest about the fear. There was fear, not the sharp, panicking kind of fear that I think people might expect in this situation, not the kind that needs to be suppressed or managed. It was a deeper and less active variety, the kind of fear that has been present for so long that it has become almost a background sensation, the way the station's drive vibration was a background sensation, felt rather than heard, present in the bones rather than in the conscious mind. I had been living with the fear for years. The fear was not new. What was new was the certainty that it would now resolve. The uncertainty was the worst part of fear, I thought. The certainty, though terrible, had a different quality. It was clear. It was something you could look at directly without flinching, because it no longer needed to be avoided. It was simply what was. I spent the remaining hours before morning making this record. The cogitator coil I am recording it to is a unit I have maintained for exactly this purpose for the last several years, maintaining it not because I consciously believed I would use it, but because the discipline of maintaining it gave me a sense of control that I needed to maintain the same way I needed the temperature records and the measurement of the room. I am recording everything I have recorded here, the whole arc of it, because I want the record to exist, because I am, despite everything, the kind of person who believes that accurate records are worth keeping even when no one will read them, and because I cannot do anything else in these hours that would constitute the kind of thinking I need to do, and I need, very badly, to continue thinking until I am no longer able to. When Marev returns this morning, I will give him the solution. I will give it to him completely, including the derivation documentation, because I want him to have the complete thing, not as a display of my capabilities, but because the complete thing is what might stop the transmission. And stopping the transmission is why the work was done. The 9 months of increasing complexity in the transmission, the psycher's description of something very large and very old, turning its attention, these are not abstractions to me. I have spent 30 years working in the logistical shadow of the Imperium's existential struggles, and I understand, with the particular clarity that comes from a lifetime of assembling complete pictures from partial data, that the things the Imperium faces in the dark are real. I solved this cipher because it needed to be solved. I solved it because I was the only one who could solve it. I solved it because I am made of the kind of thinking that could do nothing else when confronted with a thing that was solvable and needed to be solved. And I solved it knowing what it meant, because I have never been the kind of person who could pretend not to know things I know. Now I want to think about the thing I have been thinking around for these past few hours. The thing I have been tracing the edges of without approaching directly, which is not the cipher, and not Marev, and not the mechanics of what is going to happen this morning, but the deeper structural question that this situation makes unavoidable, which is the question of why it has to happen at all. Why the Imperium must do this, not why it chooses to do this, or why the specific people in it make the specific decisions that make it happen. Why, at the level of institutional and structural logic, it cannot do otherwise. This is not a question I am asking in bitterness. I want to be careful about that. Bitterness would make this a personal grievance, a private wound, and what I have come to understand is that it is neither personal nor a wound. It is simply the truth of the system, visible now in its entirety, in a way it has never quite been visible to me before, perhaps because the proximity of my own ending has removed the last small, comforting distortions that self-interest introduces into analysis. The Imperium of mankind is a civilization operating at permanent crisis conditions across a scale of space and time that no human mind was designed to encompass. It governs 10,000 worlds, or 100,000, or more, depending on which records you trust, and which have been lost or falsified. It maintains this governance not through any coherent administrative system but through a patchwork of overlapping institutional authorities, each with its own doctrine, its own hierarchy, its own sacred texts and approved methodologies, each one serving a genuine function, but also serving its own perpetuation, each one maintaining its position within the larger structure, partly by performing its function, and partly by preventing other institutions from performing that function, or from demonstrating that they could. The Mechanicus controls technology, the Ministorum controls faith, the Adeptus Administratum controls documentation. The Inquisition controls threats to all of the above. These institutions are not unified except by the umbrella of the Emperor's authority, and the Emperor has been a dying presence on a golden throne for 10,000 years, unable to communicate except through intermediaries whose own institutional agendas necessarily color the communications they claim to relay. In this structure, doctrine is not merely a body of knowledge. Doctrine is load-bearing. Doctrine is the institutional skeleton that maintains the coherence of each body within the larger organism. If the Mechanicus's doctrine about STC analysis is challenged and proved incorrect by an unauthorized source, it is not merely a technical embarrassment. It is a structural threat, because the Mechanicus's authority derives from its claimed exclusive capacity to correctly interpret technological heritage. If that interpretation can be duplicated or exceeded by an unlicensed savant with a notebook and 30 years of informal study, the basis of the Mechanicus's claim to authority is in question. And a Mechanicus in institutional crisis does not serve the Imperium. A Mechanicus in institutional crisis becomes a political entity competing for survival rather than a technical institution maintaining the machines that keep 10,000 worlds alive. This is not a hypothetical. This is the logic of the actual. Extend the principle. An administrator who solves the routing problems that officially approved methodology cannot solve does not merely make the approved methodology look inadequate. They demonstrate, by their existence, that the barrier between what can be solved and what cannot be solved is not a genuine epistemic barrier, but an institutional one, a barrier created and maintained by the structures of authority rather than by the genuine limits of human cognition. This demonstration is far more dangerous than any individual problem solution, however significant, because if the barrier is institutional rather than epistemic, then the question of what barriers are genuinely epistemic becomes open, and the opening of that question, in a civilization that maintains its coherence partly through citizens not asking it, is a destabilizing event. The Imperium cannot afford destabilization, not at this scale, not under these pressures, not with the enemies it faces. Every one of those enemies, the ruinous powers, the Xenos, the malevolent intelligence of the ancient machines, every one of them is in some sense patient, and the Imperium is not. The Imperium must hold together now, today, through this century, through the next crisis, through the one after that, by whatever means are available, and the means available are primarily these: hierarchy, doctrine, faith, and the suppression of questions that hierarchy and doctrine and faith cannot answer without threatening themselves. I have spent 30 years asking unapproved questions and finding correct answers. Every correct answer was a small demonstration that the approved methodology was inadequate. Every demonstration was a small crack in the institutional architecture. The cracks were individually invisible. Collectively, in the mind of an institution like the Inquisition, which exists precisely to perceive patterns that individual institutional bodies cannot perceive, they add up to something very legible. What they add up to is heresy. Not heresy in the ruinous powers sense, not corruption, not taint, not the conscious or unconscious embrace of chaos. Heresy in the institutional sense, which is, in many ways, the more precise and more dangerous category. Institutional heresy is the production of variant doctrine, which is the demonstration that approved doctrine is variant, which is the demonstration that approved doctrine is not the only possible doctrine, which is the first step toward approved doctrine losing the quality of divine authority that makes it effective as a load-bearing element in the Imperium's structure. A man who proves the Imperium wrong about what is possible is not merely incorrect by inquisitorial standards. He is a corrupting influence on the certainty that the Imperium requires its citizens to maintain to function as a civilization. There is a further layer to this, and it is the one that I have spent this night approaching most carefully, because it is the one that most resists the comfortable distortions of self-interest. The warp is real. The entities that inhabit the warp are real. They are not metaphors for human irrationality. They are not products of mass psychology projected outward into a neutral universe. They are genuine, independent, malevolent forces of a kind that human consciousness is not equipped to interact with safely, and they are drawn to certain qualities of human mental activity the way physical mass is drawn toward other physical mass, not through any intention on the part of the thinking person, but through the structural properties of thought that is operating outside the boundaries of consensus. Independent thought produces cognitive patterns that differ from the consensus patterns that the Imperium's institutional structure maintains. Cognitive patterns that differ from consensus have a different relationship to the warp than consensus patterns do. The warp's interest is drawn to difference, to intensity, to the specific kind of cognitive sharpness that comes from operating without the dampening effect of approved methodology. I am not a psyker. I have never shown any measurable psychic potential. But I have, for 30 years, been a mind operating at a level of independent cognitive intensity that is, by the Imperium standards, genuinely unusual, and that unusual intensity is not categorically different from the intensity that makes psychers dangerous. It is different in mechanism, but not necessarily in the quality of its warp-facing profile. The cipher was a demonstration of this. The cipher was not merely a technical challenge. It was, as I said, a test, a question asking whether the mind engaging with it understood the relationship between structured thought and its consequences. The question was addressed, in the precise architectural grammar of whoever made the cipher, to a specific kind of mind, a mind capable of the synthetic volumetric cognition required to read all layers simultaneously. The cipher was designed to find me. Not me specifically, but the category of mind that I represent. And when I engaged with it, when I solved it, I gave that category of mind a very clear signal to whatever was on the other end of the transmission. Something turned its attention toward the installation. The explicator needs the cipher solved because the alternative is worse. He knows that solving it will confirm to whatever is listening that the kind of mind that can solve it exists within range of the installation. He knows this, and he sent for me anyway, because the alternative was to leave the transmission running indefinitely, and an indefinitely running transmission to something very large and very old that is already turning its attention is a catastrophically worse outcome than a confirmed signal that can then be addressed. The mathematics of the situation are clear, and they require my participation, and they require my subsequent removal. I understand this. I do not resent it. I want to say that again, because I want to be certain I am being honest. I do not resent it. I have spent 30 years solving problems that required someone to think outside the boundaries of what the Imperium permitted, and I have always known what that cost would eventually be, and the cost is rational, and the rationality of it is the part that I find most painful, and also the part that I find, in some sense I cannot fully articulate, the part that most confirms what I have always believed about the nature of correct thinking. Correct thinking follows the structure of what is true, wherever that structure leads, even when it leads to conclusions that are personally unwelcome. The conclusion that the Imperium is correct to destroy people like me is personally unwelcome. It is also, at the level of structural logic, correct. And I am not the kind of person who can pretend not to know things I know. Let me try to say this with the precision it deserves. The Imperium has no good choices. It never did. It maintains civilization, imperfect and brutal and grinding and magnificent in its terrible persistence, against enemies that would end human life in the galaxy entirely, if given the opportunity, and it maintains this civilization at the cost of crushing everything within it that might, if left to develop, either strengthen it dramatically or destroy it catastrophically, and it cannot distinguish between those two outcomes reliably enough to bet 10,000 worlds on its ability to get the distinction right. So it defaults to crushing. It crushes unauthorized thought and unlicensed brilliance and variant doctrine not out of malice but out of a risk calculation, that is, from the perspective of institutional survival over geological timescales, genuinely reasonable. The minds it destroys might, if developed and integrated, produce solutions that save billions. They also might, if corrupted or if simply noticed by the wrong things in the warp, produce vectors for something far worse than the problems they were solving. The Imperium cannot tell the difference. There is no approved methodology for telling the difference. The question of whether an unauthorized mind is a resource or a liability cannot be answered without a process of evaluation that takes time, and the Imperium does not have time, and the evaluation process itself, conducted by the kind of institutional bodies with the authority to conduct it, would require exposing the unauthorized mind to levels of institutional attention that would, by their own logic, confirm the need for execution before the evaluation could conclude. The trap has no exit. The trap was built without an exit, because an exit would have required someone to design one, and designing an exit would have required exactly the kind of unauthorized independent thinking that the trap is designed to eliminate. I find this beautiful, in the way I find all genuinely closed systems beautiful. The elegance of it is heartbreaking. The elegance of it is also, finally, something I can set down. There is one more thing I want to record before Marev returns. I have spent 30 years telling myself that my work was service, that the problems I solved served the people of the Imperium even if not the institutions of the Imperium, that there was a meaningful distinction between those two things, and that the distinction justified everything I did and everything I risked, and the exposure of everyone who helped me. I want to examine this honestly in the time I have left. The distinction is real. The people on those 7 systems who did not starve because of Vithara IV are real. The people on the 3 systems that were not overrun because of the WAG prediction are real. The Mechanicus engineer who spent 30 years trying to reconstruct the atmospheric scrubber design and finally had a complete template to work from is real. His 30 years of struggle and the worlds those scrubbers will eventually serve, all of that is real. I made a difference that was real and material, and I do not disown it. I am not going to spend my last hours telling myself that none of it mattered. But I also did not do it only for them. I did it because thinking was what I was, and problems were what gave thinking its purpose, and the people who needed the problems solved gave me the problems, and through the problems gave me the purpose, and through the purpose gave me the sense of being necessary that I needed in a way that I was never comfortable acknowledging even to myself. I used them as much as they used me, not in an exploitative sense, but in the fundamental sense that every relationship of mutual need is a relationship of mutual use, and pretending otherwise is a sentimentality that does not serve honest understanding. I wanted to be known. I wanted the correctness of my thinking to matter to someone. I wanted, in the private grammar of a person who had always operated in invisibility, to be seen. And they saw me, each one of them in their desperate and temporary and officially denied way. They saw what I could do and they needed it, and they took it, and they were grateful, and the gratitude was real, even when it could not be spoken aloud, and that was enough. For 30 years that was enough, and I am grateful to them for it even now, even knowing that the seeing was what made me visible, and the visibility is what ends me. The door will open when Marev is ready for me. I want to use the remaining time well. I am going to read the cipher again, not because I need to, not because there is anything in it I have not already extracted, but because it was the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen, and I would like to see it one more time, with the particular attention of someone who is seeing it for the last time. There is a quality of attention that knowing something is the last time grants that no other circumstance can produce, a sharpness and a tenderness simultaneously, a desire to apprehend completely before apprehension is no longer possible. I want to give the cipher that quality of attention. It deserves it. Whatever mind made it, however alien, however ancient, it was a mind, and it made something real and precise, and in its way beautiful. And beautiful things deserve the best attention you can give them. I am also going to drink the last of the recaf. There is enough for one more cup. I made this batch stronger than usual, which I do not typically do because too much recaf affects my processing speed and I prefer consistency. But processing speed is not what I need right now. I need the warmth. I need the smell. I need the specific small comfort of a hot liquid in a chipped ceramic mug in a room I have lived in for 19 years, surrounded by 30 years of notebooks, and the ambient hum of 2 cogitator terminals that should not work and do, because I made them work, because I am the kind of person who cannot let a broken thing stay broken when the repair is within reach. That is, ultimately, the whole of it. I cannot let a broken thing stay broken when the repair is within reach. The Imperium is, in the sense that matters most, irreparably broken, broken in ways that are structural and intentional and self-sustaining, broken in ways that are also, at the scale of alternatives available, the least bad option for 10,000 worlds and 100 billion people who have no other civilization to belong to. I cannot repair that. I could not repair it in 30 years of small corrections and shadow network solutions and borrowed hours in unlit corridor meetings, but I repaired what was within reach, because I had to, because I am what I am, and I do not regret being what I am, even knowing what it cost. The cipher sits on the slate on the corner of the secondary terminal. The solution sits beside it. The solution is correct. I know it is correct the way I know all correct things, in the bones, in the structural sense, in the place where thinking becomes clear enough to stop being thought and starts being simply known. The cipher asked its question, and I answered it, and the answer is complete and true, and will do what it needs to do, and whatever else is true about this morning, and what it brings, the answer is correct, and the answer will persist in whatever record the inquisitorial team makes of it, even if the record attributes the solution to an approved Mechanicus algorithm, rather than to a person who was never approved and never algorithmic, and was, in the only taxonomy that seems to me to genuinely matter, simply someone who could not look at a solvable problem and choose not to solve it. That is my epitaph, if epitaphs were a thing available to people like me. He could not look at a solvable problem and choose not to solve it. I have been thinking, these last hours, about the boy in the cold archive room who solved the first problem. The 9-year-old who looked at what 40 trained administrators could not untangle, and simply untangled it, not out of ambition, not out of the desire to distinguish himself, but because the answer was there, and he could see it, and it felt wrong to not say so. I wonder, sometimes, what would have happened if that boy had kept quiet. If he had looked at the problem, and looked at the answer, and understood, even at 9, what saying so would eventually cost, and had made the choice to be silent, had learned the discipline of suppression, had trained himself, over years, to be the kind of person who can see answers and choose not to speak them. I cannot imagine it. That is the honest truth. I cannot construct a version of myself in which that suppression was possible. Not because I lacked the self-discipline. I have self-discipline. I have demonstrated self-discipline in every other area of my life for 30 years. But self-discipline requires a self to discipline, and the self that I am is, at its deepest level, the thing that sees answers. If I suppressed that, the self that remained would not be a disciplined version of me. It would be a different person, a person who saw nothing. A person who, in the particular moral vocabulary I was developing even at 9, had already decided that the cost of seeing was too high and had chosen blindness. I could not have chosen blindness. I still cannot. This is not a virtue. I want to be very clear about this. I am not framing this as a heroic quality. The inability to choose blindness, when blindness is the thing that keeps you alive, is not a strength. It is a structural feature of a particular kind of cognition, and whether it is a good feature or a bad feature depends entirely on the circumstances in which it operates. In different circumstances, in a different civilization, in an era before and perhaps after this grinding age of desperate maintenance, it might have been exactly the right quality. In this circumstance, in this civilization, in this era, it was lethal. The question I cannot stop turning over, the one that keeps returning to me in the hour before dawn as this station's artificial day cycle prepares to begin, is whether the Imperium knows what it loses, not in the specific sense, not the names of the people, not the details of the work, but in the aggregate sense. Whether there is somewhere in the vast and grinding apparatus of imperial administration a record, necessarily unofficial, necessarily hidden, necessarily maintained by exactly the kind of person who would be destroyed for maintaining it, of what the approved methodology cannot do, and what the unauthorized minds have done, and what the gap between those two things costs the civilization that refuses to officially close it. I think there must be, in some deep archive of the Inquisition or in the private records of some senior administratum official, or perhaps in the careful mental catalogue of an explicator who has performed this specific function more than once, some awareness of the full accounting, some recognition that every unlicensed savant executed for unauthorized intellectual activity was a solution generator being permanently decommissioned, some awareness of the magnitude of what is lost. I think Marev is that person, or something close to it. I think his genuine sorrow, the sorrow I perceived in his voice and his expression when he explained what he needed and what he was going to have to do about it afterward, the sorrow that is not guilt, not because he is incapable of guilt, but because what he is doing does not, in his honest assessment, rise to the level of guilt. I think that sorrow comes from exactly this awareness. He knows the accounting, he knows what I represent in the aggregate, and he performs his function anyway, because he is also a person who follows the structure of what is true to its conclusions, and the conclusion in this case is that the Imperium cannot afford the precedent. The precedent, that is the part that took me the longest to fully accept, and I want to try to explain it precisely because it is the part that feels most arbitrary and turns out to be the most structurally necessary. If I solve the cipher and survive, I become a precedent. Not just a person who solved a problem, a precedent for the class of problem solver I represent. A demonstrated case that unauthorized, unlicensed, independent cognitive work can produce solutions superior to sanctioned methodology. Once that precedent exists in an official context, in a context where it cannot be quietly attributed to a mechanicus algorithm or an approved analytical process, it becomes available to every future administrator who needs a problem solved and cannot solve it through sanctioned channels. It becomes, in the informal network of people who operate in the margins of the Imperium, a new piece of knowledge, that the Inquisition itself has used this, and the person survived. That survival is the signal. Once the signal exists, it changes the calculation for every unauthorized thinker and every desperate administrator in the entire informal network. It makes the network more active, more bold, more visible. It increases the rate at which unauthorized intellectual activity happens, increases the rate at which that activity attracts warp attention, increases the rate at which the institutional architecture is exposed to the corrosive demonstration that the approved methodology is inadequate. The precedent is not a small thing. The precedent is, in the Imperium's institutional logic, the beginning of a cascade, and cascades, in a civilization held together by the weight of accumulated doctrine and the faith of 100 billion people, cannot be permitted to start. So I will not survive, and the solution will be attributed to an approved source, and the cipher will be solved, and the transmission will stop, and the record will show nothing that challenges the approved methodology, and the Imperium will continue. It will continue holding its 10,000 worlds together through hierarchy and doctrine and faith and the suppression of questions, and it will face its next crisis with the same broken and magnificent and irreplaceable machinery it has always used, and some of that machinery will be serviced by people like me, operating in the margins, solving the things that cannot officially be solved, and eventually those people will also be found and also be closed, and the machinery will continue. The machinery will continue. I find I am not angry about this. I have been examining myself carefully for anger, because anger would be a legitimate response, and I want to give every legitimate response its due in this final accounting, and I find that what is present is not anger. What is present is something I can only call recognition, the recognition of a system seen clearly, in its full logic, without the distortion of either hope or despair. The recognition of someone who has spent 30 years solving systems and is now, for the first time, seeing the system that contains all the other systems, seeing its structure and its constraints and its terrible rationality, and understanding it the way he understands everything, completely, down to the bones. I understand why the Imperium executes its smartest people, not because it is stupid, not because it is malevolent, not because the people who make these decisions are lesser beings who fear what they cannot comprehend, but because it is rational, and because rationality applied at the scale of a civilization facing extinction must prioritize institutional survival over individual contribution, and because individual contribution at the level I was operating at is not merely a benefit to the institution, but a demonstration that the institution is unnecessary, and an institution that can be demonstrated to be unnecessary is an institution that will eventually be dismantled, and the dismantling of any load-bearing element of the imperial structure in the current era is a risk that cannot be accepted. I am not the solution. I was never the solution. I was a patch, a temporary correction applied to a system that needs its structural flaws addressed, not temporarily corrected. The corrections I provided kept the system running. Running systems do not get restructured. Restructuring requires crisis, and my corrections reduced crisis. By solving the problems, I made the system that produced them slightly more sustainable, slightly more capable of persisting in its broken state, slightly less likely to face the kind of total failure that might have forced the kind of structural reform that would have made people like me unnecessary. I held the Imperium up. The Imperium held me down. We were useful to each other in ways that were, finally, incompatible. This is also the truth of the thing. Morning has come to Ferronox in the station's artificial sense, the lumen strips in the corridor outside brightening to the higher setting that marks the day cycle, visible to me as a thin line of increased light under the workroom door. The station is beginning its daily routines, the distant footfalls of early workers beginning their shifts, the increase in atmospheric circulation as the day cycle ventilation settings activate, the subtle warming of the recycled air that the day cycle temperature programming introduces, 3 degrees warmer in the day hours than the night hours, a concession to human comfort that the station's designers included and that the station has maintained for 4,000 years because no subsequent administrator could find a procedural basis to override it. 3 degrees of warmth for the humans, maintained by the inertia of 4,000 years of unchanged instruction. The Imperium keeps 3 degrees of warmth for the humans. It keeps them, generation after generation, in their appropriate roles, with their appropriate knowledge, within their appropriate doctrinal frameworks, and it provides warmth, because warmth is necessary for human function, and human function is necessary for imperial function. It provides exactly as much warmth as is necessary, and no more, because more would be waste, and it maintains the provision through the inertia of established instruction, rather than through any ongoing care for the humans themselves, and the humans continue, and the machine continues, and the void beyond every wall continues. I am going to close this record now. I am going to close it because I have said what I needed to say, and continuing would be repetition, and I have never been able to tolerate repetition because it is the opposite of accuracy. I have said the true things. I have traced the structure of this situation to its conclusion. I have been correct about it, which is, I recognize now, the only mode available to me, the only mode I have ever inhabited, the only mode that ever made me feel like myself. The slate with the solution sits on the corner of the terminal. The chipped ceramic mug is on the primary terminal surface. The notebooks are against the inner wall, 312 of them, 30 years of thinking, none of it visible to any institution, all of it real. The door will open. I will give him the solution. He will thank me, and the thanks will be genuine, because Marev is exactly the kind of man who cannot offer a dishonest emotion even at the end of a transaction like this one, and I appreciate that about him more than I can say. Appreciate it the way I have always appreciated things that are precisely what they claim to be. He will give an order. The order will be carried out with the efficiency and discretion appropriate to the institutional context. The record will note that an approved Mechanicus algorithm produced the solution, and the explicator will close the file, and the transmission will stop, and Ferronox will continue its orbit around nothing in particular, and somewhere in the Sharon expanse, an installation will go silent, and something very large and very old will turn its attention away. The Imperium will continue. The charcoal blanket is still around my shoulders. The room is 19 degrees. The lumen strip above the primary terminal is flickering again, the rhythm I have timed my breathing to for 19 years. The recaf is finished. I was here for 30 years, thinking. Every thought was real, every solution was correct. Every person who received a solution and survived because of it was a person who lived, and living is the most specific and irreducible thing there is, and I am grateful that my thinking gave some people more of it. I am grateful that I was the kind of person who could not look at a solvable problem and choose not to solve it. I am grateful for Praxis Setha, who protected me with her careful institutional thinking for longer than I deserved. I am grateful for every desperate administrator in every unlit corridor who looked at what I offered and chose to trust it, knowing the risk, knowing the unofficial nature of it, choosing to use an unauthorized tool because the approved tools were inadequate and the need was real. I am grateful to have been needed. I am grateful to have been, however briefly and however invisibly, known. The truth arrived quietly, as it always does, as I think it always must. It arrived in the form of a man who sat at my corner table with no evident urgency and smiled without performance and needed what only I could give. It arrived in the form of a question 11,000 years old that no sanctioned mind could answer. It arrived in the form of the answer to that question, clear and complete and correct, sitting on a slate on the corner of a secondary cogitator terminal, in a room 14 feet by 12 feet, on a station, orbiting nothing in particular, in the void between stars. The answer is correct. The Imperium could not afford it. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the gap between them is not a contradiction but a description of the precise and permanent tragedy of what this age is, what it costs, and what it must continue to cost until something changes that I will not live to see, and that may never come. My name is Dialectus Vaughan. I was here. I was correct.